And here we are. I'm pretty much picking up where we left off with the last video. You can see me filling in the blue background there. It was really important to get some of this background pretty dark, not quite black, but pretty dark so that the other layers would set well against it. Really went to work on this background for a long time. A lot of it I ended up going over with white to kind of erase it and correct certain parts of it here and there, or accentuate some curves. So you see me going back and forth between different shades of blue and white, a little bit of green, also phthalo green. Utilizing a lot of negative space for the smoke. It was fun to do this smoke. Basically, you just start it from nothing and build it up step by step. You get different ideas for it as you're going. It's important to just keep working on it. Hey, you see me drop the paper off of the clamps there for a second. Sometimes I would have it hanging on by a thread just so I could get a little more of the edge. And sometimes it falls off. Sometimes I have tape holding it down in certain corners. I've been thinking of making some kind of like tabletop rig to where I won't have the camera strapped on my head anymore. So I'm going to work on that. The problem is something like that would just take up a lot of space. The situation I have here, I can just break it down and move it if need be. But something like a camera on a tabletop, sort of on a tripod. I don't know, that would take up a lot of space. And they're adjusting the clamp some more. Didn't really use any browns in the background. The darkest tones I got basically by just building blues and greens on top of each other. And yeah, like I mentioned in the last video, laying that layer of orange down to kind of sketch out the shape of the smoke allowed me to blend blues into it to make a pretty cool green. I'm just working on the background a lot here. It's gonna go on for a while, just working on the background. But something like this takes time. It takes time to figure out how you want it to look. Layering a lot of white in now. And just adding more details to the smoke as I go. Thought it was cool to have layers, like this layer curling in behind that layer. Have all the different layers interact with each other. Creates depth. You can see me working on the hat some more. Putting some blue on top of the browns. Layer in more blue smoke. And basically the way I made the smoke is I drew those crystals in, and I kind of used the tips of the crystals as a starting point and just made some squiggly lines off of those. I wanted the crystals to kind of float with the smoke somewhat, so that was kind of the way I did that. Yeah, it looks like I'm laying a little bit of brown into that hat to kind of bring out the darker parts of it. And it helps to water these colors down a little bit so that they're a little more transparent. So when you lay the brown over the blue, it doesn't come out looking super brown. It just kind of all blends together. You don't want to water it down too much though, and then there's barely anything there. So find balance. I ended up changing the background between the crystals and the smoke a little bit later on, but I wanted to kind of give the crystals a really solid background to build off of them. It's a little easier to see the edges and the different layers. But later on I decided I wanted a little bit of a different interaction between the back of the crystals and the start of the background. So I kind of had some smoke going down in between some darker pockets, and just kind of found a way to make the layers interact a little more. Yeah, I really went for it with that smoke. I really attacked it for a few solid days in a row, working on it, probably like 4 or 5 hours a day. You can see me start working on the crystals now. And I'm building the crystals up the same way that I did with the smoke, with the brighter orange color. I wanted the colors to be pretty similar, but I did the crystals a little bit different, to where I did allow a little bit of that brighter color to show through on some of the edges, just so it looked like it was kind of like glistening the way the light hits it. And I mixed up a much brighter green to use with the crystals also. But here I am just working on the layers. I didn't really get into the blues until I got to around the end of working on them. Just because I wanted the blue to be mainly like the highlight color. Kind of use it with the negative space and the white of the paper. But I'm blending some blues over the greens and the orange right now. And just figuring out the different layers as I go. The crystals were pretty fun to work on. It was a little more fun to work on the smoke. And I go back to working on the smoke a little bit here and there. I'm not quite done with it just yet. But I wanted to get a start on those crystals before I neglected them for too long. It's easy to abandon projects when you don't really work on different parts of it altogether. Say, like, if I just spent the whole time working on the smoke until I was finished with that, and then I just have these blank crystals, it's a lot easier to just not get in the mood to paint crystals. But if I'm, maybe like a good quarter or the third of the way into the painting the crystals by the time I'm finishing up with the smoke, then it's a lot easier to kind of pick up where you leave off, because you're a good portion of it into it anyway, and it's not going to be as much work as if you hadn't started on them at all. So that's more or less what I'm doing here, is just kind of getting the crystals started. And I worked on one side of the crystals a lot more than the other side because I didn't want to be going back and forth between them and smudging it up with my hands. And also I just wanted to practice on one side a little bit before I really committed to doing the other side. Just to kind of have a better game plan in my head for the next side, because I've already done it once before that. And you can see me blending that bright green into the edges there. And at first I did that because it really helped it pop out against the background. I didn't want the crystals to get lost in the smoke. And blending that bright green to kind of set it up against it. I go over it with blues later on, but the fact that it had a base of a bright green made it stand out a little more against the other blues in the smoke. And I mixed that bright green up by using a little bit of the blue that I had for the smoke and mixing it with a little bit of yellow. I think I made another bright green by adding a little bit of yellow to the phthalo green at one point, just to have something that stood out a little bit from the other green, a little variety. I show my palette at the end of the video. I mixed up a couple teal colors too to do with the smoke and the crystals by just playing around with different combinations of the phthalo green and blue and white, a little bit of yellow. A lot of little details in those crystals. It really took a long time to do the crystals too, a lot longer than I thought they would be. If I had to say what took the longest, it'd be the smoke, but not by much. The crystals were pretty close after that. Maybe a difference of about a day. Worked on the crystals for a few days, probably like 2 or 3 days. And there I'm going with the other side, getting them started with the orange, kind of getting the layers started. And jumping back and forth between those crystals and the face a little more, and a little more to the goatee. And I built that just with a couple different browns. I had a burnt umber brown and a kind of a Sierra brown, and also some phthalo green. A little bit of blue here and there for the darker parts. I blended that with the browns. But it's like I was saying earlier, I built that goatee up just gradually throughout the whole painting. And you know, it's a lot easier to work on it a little bit here, a little bit there, than if you finish one part and then you have this completely blank part that you have to work on. A lot easier to stay motivated when you're kind of bouncing all around the painting and you've got a good portion of a lot of it done by the time you finish one part of it. And before you saw me blending some dark blue in with the edges of the crystals just to kind of make them set against the smoke a little more. Now I'm adding a little bit of white to the smoke in the highlight parts of the crystals. Added a dark blue outline to the edge of the crystals so that they'd stand out against the smoke. And I kind of blended some of that blue up into the smoke here and there where there's little pockets of it, or maybe a line breaks off, just so that it's not like a harsh outline and that it blended into the background. Crystals are fun because, I don't know, it's hard to mess them up. As long as you have a lot of different edges and different colors and the shading is where it's supposed to be and you have highlights where they're supposed to be, you can kind of just have fun with it. And since they just form into so many different shapes naturally, you can just have fun and get crazy with it. This one I thought it would be cool to have them growing in a lot of different directions and just have a lot of different jagged edges kind of pointing off in different directions. Like they're sort of growing out of control. The edges of the crystals I built up with different dark blues and the dark phthalo green. Just blending them into each other, a few different layers over top of each other. Do one layer, wait on it to dry. You can work on other stuff while you're waiting it to dry. Come back to it. That's the biggest challenge with painting, I find, is keeping keeping track of your own ideas as you're working on them. But if you start in with a painting session with a solid goal in mind, and every now and then take breaks and sort of evaluate where you're at, adjust your goals as you go, you can stay on track. If you decide you don't like the way something looks, you can always paint over it. Still working on these edges. With the crystals, I think the thing that took the longest was finding a balance to where the bright greens and the oranges that I put in would shut through a little bit, but that the blue was still the dominant color. It took some work to get there, but I'm pretty happy with the result. Working on the goatee some more. Like I was saying, build it up little bit by little bit, and it's not as daunting at the end of the day. And I'm doing the same thing with the face too. I'm blending a little bit of flesh tone in now, looks like, off of the blues that I laid down, bringing out those wrinkles a little more. And I'm careful to preserve a good bit of that negative space too, to serve as the highlights on the face. That's important. And at first, this flesh tone that I mixed up came out looking a little pink, and I was worried that maybe I'd have to mix up something else and go over it and kind of blend into it to find the right tone. But when I came back the next day after laying this layer in, it looked pretty good. The paint's kind of, set in and dried overnight, and they definitely change after a few hours of being dry and kind of settling in. So keep that in mind if you're working on something like this and the color doesn't come out 100% the way you like. Give it a day and come back to it. Sometimes you just come back to it with a fresh pair of eyes and you see it a different way too. And then it's like, oh, okay, it doesn't bother me the same way anymore. I had a lighter color. It was like a really, really light blue with a little bit of a green to it, kind of like an aquamarine type color that I watered down a lot, and I blended into the edges on some of those highlights so that the white of the paper didn't show through so much, where the highlight was a little softer. But I'd done most of the work already on the face when I had laid those blues and greens down in the darker corners. Laying the flesh tone over it was really not much work at all, and it didn't require much thought, because most of that work had already been done with those blues and greens.
Alright, here it is, all finished up. That was a tough one to get through. It's about 11 by 14, so it's not huge, but the fact that every little bit of this paper is painted took a while. Probably spent the most time on that smoke, but I'm really excited with how it turned out. The blues and the greens that I put in really play well off each other. Here's a look at my palette. We had a couple different light blues, dark blue. This is that phthalo green. That's most of the green that you're seeing up in here in the background. Layered into the crystals too. I used some of it in the face. I use that phthalo green with everything really. Dark brown, light brown. There's a flesh tone. There's like kind of a reddish orange. They're all dried out. I use this bright green too, and also a couple different kind of teal colors that mixed in the smoke. So yeah, that was a fun one. Took a little over 2 weeks, I want to say, not quite 3 weeks. Just working on it here and there. There was a couple days there that I didn't get around to it because I was just busy with other stuff. But yeah, there it is. Hit like if you enjoyed watching it, subscribe for more content. I keep saying I'm gonna do weekly content, but some of these projects take a little longer than a week to do, so I just update as I finish them, but typically a week to 2 weeks. So yeah, see you next time.